Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm talking about One Palestine Complete, Jews and Arabs Under the British Mandate by Tom Segev. And this is the first of 3 back-to-back reviews I'm going to have to do. As you can see, there's quite a lot to cover. So I'm going to be doing the first video on the Jews, the second on the Palestinians, and then the third on the British and the UN. And as always, I can't possibly cover everything I'd like to cover. All I can do is highlight some quotes and some ideas for you and hope that they provoke some thought and some questions for yourself. So we'll start very early in the book. Many of the Jews living in Palestine did not support Zionism. Indeed, much of the pre-Zionist Jewish population, that is, those who lived in Palestine before the 1880s, were ultra-Orthodox. They were deeply hostile to the notion of secular Jewish autonomy in the Holy Land, which, according to religious doctrine, would be redeemed only through divine intervention in the Messianic age. To the traditional Jewish population of Palestine, the Zionist ideal of secular redemption was sacrilegious. A deep abyss separates the two parts of the Yishuv, Ben-Gurion wrote, calling for war against the rabbis who are betraying their people. In addition to their abhorrence of Zionism's secular ideals, they feared that Zionist activity would cause the authorities to act against all the Jews, and saw the increasing power of the Zionists as competition for the leadership of the community. So it wasn't just the Palestinians that the Zionists were fighting. They were fighting the, quote, rabbis who are betraying the people. And remember that Zionism is a new idea. It is not a religious idea. It is a secular idea, and it plays on using, strangely, the religion of Judaism, but applying it to people and making it a nationality that has no religion, which they also will make the claim to the land of Israel under religious guises, but they themselves are not religious. It's an entirely incoherent idea. When the Zionists who had been living in Europe finally got to Israel and got specifically to Jerusalem, they were dismayed at what they saw. This is from Chaim Weizmann, who was one of the leaders of World Jewry. I have been here in Jerusalem nearly a week trying to make some order out of this mess, he wrote to his wife. There is nothing more humiliating, than our Jerusalem. Anything that could be done to desecrate and defile the sacred has been done. It's impossible to imagine so much falsehood, blasphemy, greed, so many lies. He hated the city in a very concrete way, too. It's such an accursed city. There's nothing there, no creature comforts. So they didn't have a great impression when they first got there. But their idea was, that's okay. We're going to buy off the Arabs, buy off the Palestinians, and then we can clean this place up. The Western Wall remained under Muslim ownership. It is doubtful whether there was ever a real chance of it being sold to the Zionists. The episode followed the well-established dynamic between the Jews and Arabs. The Jews believed that they could buy the Arabs' consent to Zionist rule with money, but managed to bribe only a few collaborators here and there. This is Chaim Margalit Kalwaryski, a Polish-born agronomist who had been living in the Galilee since the 1890s and worked to purchase land for Zionism. It was his belief that the Arabs could simply be paid off. And he relates a story here of buying the land from some people and how he felt for himself about it. It was very strange. The question of the Arabs first appeared to me in all its seriousness immediately after the first purchase of land I made here. I had to dispossess the Arab residents of their land for the purpose of settling our brothers. The doleful dirge of the Bedouin men and women who gathered outside the Sheikh's tent that evening, before they left the village of Shamsin, next to Yama, which is Yavniel, did not stop ringing in my ears for a long time thereafter. I sat in the tent and concluded my negotiation with Sheikh Fadul Madalika. The Bedouin men and women gathered around the fire, prepared coffee for me and for the rest of the guests, and at the same time they sang songs of mourning for their bad fortune, which forced them to leave the cradle of their birth. Those songs cut through my heart, and I realized how tied the Bedouin is to his land. He had been dispossessing Arabs for 25 years. Kalwaryski said, it was not easy work, especially for a man like him, who did not see the Arabs as a flock of sheep, but rather as human beings with hearts and souls. He had to turn them off the land because the Jewish public demanded it of him. but he always tried to ensure that the people did not leave empty-handed and that the land speculating effendis with whom he did business did not rob the simple folk of their money. And I just want to pause for a moment. If you haven't picked it up, Tom Segev is an excellent writer. And I was so drawn into this book that I read more slowly than I normally would read because I just enjoyed the way that he dug into the story of how the Jews and the Palestinians lived with each other during this time period, and how much hope there was in some quarters and how much real despair there was. But there was still the idea that all things were possible in some way. So in addition to the idea that they were going to buy the Arabs off, you also have to realize there's an overall idea of who the Arabs are. Again, this is Chaim Weizmann. In a letter to Balfour, he suggested keeping a careful eye on the treacherous Arabs, lest they stab the army in the back. This is from Mordecai ben Hillel HaKohen. The Arab, his promise is no promise, his agreement is no agreement, he wrote in his diary. And in addition to calling them liars, they also just thought that they were lower than that. The Jews not only considered themselves, let's say, better than everyone on the earth, but particularly more so than the Arabs, as they referred to them. The Zionist movement could not continue to deny the existence of a problem and maintain that the Arabs were just a bunch of ignoramuses and bootlickers willing to sell everything for a mess of pottage. This was, again, Calvarisky, that man we talked about, who was trying to have an outlook of compassion for the Arabs. He knew that this is what his fellow Zionists really thought of the Arabs. So they're complaining that the Arabs are backwards. They can be bought off. They're lazy, and yet at the same time as they're saying this, they are themselves not being honest and not being straightforward about their goals. Sorry, there's 500 pages here, so I have to do quite a lot of flipping. So this is Edwin Samuel, son of Herbert Samuel. Nothing can be lost by waiting and colonizing slowly and introducing development carefully, while a lot can be destroyed by rushing. And this was something that many of, let's say, the more prudent Zionists were advocating for. Hey, take it slow. This is a 100-year project, and over time, we're going to win. As for Zionist ambitions for an independent state, Weizmann instructed members of the Zionist Commission to evade the question. The Zionists did aspire to an independent Jewish Palestine, but the less they spoke of it, the better, he told them. So remember, on one hand, the Arabs are liars, they're lazy, they're lower than us. And on the other side, don't tell the West what our real plans are because, well, then they might try to stop us. More along these lines, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, Palestine should once again become a Jewish commonwealth. The Zionist dream map submitted to the conference had included southern Lebanon, the Golan Heights, and a large area east of the Jordan River. So much, much larger than Eretz Israel. This large, let's say, going to the Euphrates even, idea for the Zionists who are willing to dream the biggest, if you want to put it that way. Oh, good old Menachem Ushishkin. The Jewish people want a Jewish state without compromises and without concessions, from Dan to Beersheba, from the Great Sea to the desert, including Transjordan. I mean, at least they're honest, right? They want all of it. They want all of it. They're entitled to all of it. They're the chosen people. God gave them the land. Everyone else just needs to move out. And if you won't move out, we're going to kill you. Here again, Menachem Begin says that the Jewish people have a right for the entire territory of the biblical land of Israel from the Nile to the Euphrates. Just, I want you to go to a map and visualize that. So obviously that includes Egypt, that includes a lot of other countries now, but Menachem Begin in 1942 still had this idea. And he was not alone. He was not some crazy person. He was extreme. And don't worry, we're going to get to his book soon enough, and you'll find out just how extreme he is. But he was not alone. Although he was extreme, there were plenty of other people who thought like him within the movement. So I quoted this in previous reviews, but it's always worth repeating because it's so clear that the intentions have been around for a long time. This isn't something that Zionism came up with recently. So this again comes from Theodor Herzl's diary, which I'm sure he did not plan for publication very early on in his life, but they still got published. And remember, this is the idea of transfer. Transfer is this euphemism for moving the Arabs out. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for them in the transit countries while denying them employment in our own country. June 1895. So remember that this is not a new idea. This concept has been around for a long, long time. The Arabs should be persuaded to trek. This is Israel Zangwill, who is a writer, and this is in the 1920s. He formulated an argument the Zionist movement would repeat many times. The Arabs had the whole Arab world, while the Jews only had Palestine. And as I told you before, I heard that argument in Hebron from the head of settlements there, Yishai Fleischer, to my face. I was so shocked I couldn't ask a follow-up question because I'd never heard that before. But as I read more, I find out that's not a new idea. It's been around a long time. Here it is from the 1920s. So shame on me for not knowing that ahead of time. Arthur Rupin, the Jewish agency spoke about transferring, quote, transferring, at least 100,000 Arabs. Ushishkin thought in terms of 60,000 families. I do not believe in the transfer of an individual. I believe in the transfer of entire villages, Arthur Rupin said. You read this, it's all in black and white. Tom Segev is an Israeli. This is not some conspiracy theory, fraud, propaganda against the Jews. This is an Israeli historian, I think teaches in Jerusalem. And it's here in black and white. The research is there for anyone who wants to read it. But once again, most people don't read it. They just believe whatever lies are taught to them. And as we'll see in later books, because the Jews in Arab countries were well established and they'd been there for centuries and they were happy and they had no idea to leave. The idea was to start to create problems so that they would leave. And we'll see this later when we get to that. But at this time, they were just trying to persuade European Jews to come. And the European Jews didn't want to come either. So Moshe Chertok said he suggested creating a panic in Poland to encourage the Jews to leave. We would see this later with attacks on synagogues in Iraq to try to scare the Jews into leaving, but the attacks were done by Mossad. So the Arabs weren't interested in attacking the Jews. The Israelis had to create an impression that the Jews weren't welcome there, so they would flee to Israel. But the Jews didn't want to move to Israel, not just the European Jews, but the Arab Jews. And when you have to force people to move to move someplace, is it really the way that it's supposed to be? When you move someone to a country, it's not enough to have them geographically located. You also have to get them to speak a language to detach them from their old places. So the language that was mostly used by European Jews was Yiddish. And most Jews didn't know Hebrew. Hebrew was almost dead as a language, but it needed to be revived in the Zionist mind. And so they would make demands. Mordecai ben Hillel Hakohen, we've talked about this before, he went to W.F. Sterling, the governor of Jaffa, and demanded that all administration announcements be printed in Hebrew as well as in English and in Arabic. But most Jewish settlers didn't know Hebrew. It was much more a political act than anything practical. And someone in the comment section had said, oh, well, in the West Bank, there are no signs printed in Hebrew. Who's racist? And I just thought to myself, you want to talk about ignorance? There are no Jews that live in the West Bank. They live in the settlements where they steal the land from the Palestinians. This is how a group of Jews acted towards European Jews who were speaking Yiddish, and because they wanted to get them to speak Hebrew. They sent letters to individuals and institutions, threatened to boycott businesses, and pestered passersby. Once or twice, they heckled at public lectures given in other languages, and even threw a stink bomb at a lecture by a well-known Yiddishist. Twice, they disrupted Yiddish film screenings, throwing bottles of ink and rotten eggs at the screen until the police were called. When battalion activists tried to prevent students from entering the French language Alliance School in Tel Aviv, they were arrested, tried, and fined. The High Commissioner was shocked. If this is how Jews behave toward one another, we can imagine what they will eventually do to the Arabs, he wrote. I mean, there's no idea of persuasion. The idea of, we have an idea and let's see how we can persuade people with it. It's, you must speak Hebrew, you're not a good Jew, and it's always the name calling, right? So I'm sure that these Yiddish-speaking Jews were anti-Semitic for daring to speak Yiddish instead of Hebrew. And I'm hoping that you are starting to see a pattern here. There is a maximalist tone. It's us against the world. We're always right. We're never wrong. We're better than you. And we're going to do what we want anyway. Even at the height of Jewish immigration, only 4 out of every 1,000 of the world's Jews came to Palestine. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? It was not something that they wanted. It was something that appealed to a specific subset of Jews, and those were people who were Zionists. And what were Zionists like? Well, let me give you their idea. The most desirable candidates for immigration were young, unmarried men, brave and idealistic, who would commit to work for 2 years in the agricultural settlements. Only the continuous mass immigration of young people who know how to wield a hoe, for those of you who are not native English speakers, this is a garden tool, and hold a rifle can save the yishuv from obliteration. Once again, the idea that if they were to simply buy some land and work, and that was all they wanted to do, that the Arabs would come and kill them all, when there had been Jews doing that for centuries there. The idea isn't that. It's the idea that you want to take all the land for yourself, which all the Zionists have told us that they were willing to do. They just didn't want to tell the public that. Toward the first anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, the Zionist Commission organized a parade. Governor Storrs approved on the condition that no flags be displayed and that the parade disperse some distance from the old city's Jaffa Gate. He honored the parade with his presence and made a speech, but a group of high school students violated the governor's prohibition and marched toward Jaffa Gate carrying a banner. I saw this myself on Jerusalem Day, in Jerusalem, in the Old City, in certain areas that are Muslim designated. And even myself as a non-Muslim, non-Jew, I couldn't go into those areas either. I was curious. I wanted to speak to some of them and learn a little bit more. But the young Palestinian, young Israeli kids, I'm going to say around, let's say 16 to 18, they were right in front of the Muslim market singing songs, which I don't know Hebrew, but I'm certain it was, you're an idiot, we're awesome, we defeat you, and one day hopefully you'll all be gone. I'm sure it was something along those lines. And all day long in Jerusalem, they were going around taunting the Muslims. And for the Muslims' part, they just sat there, didn't move a muscle. They've been through all this before. They know what happens. They know if they get provoked, they're the ones who are going to get it badly. So strangely enough, I don't think they were IDF, because there are different police forces inside Jerusalem. They were in a different uniform, but for their part, at least they were protecting, and they were yelling at the young Israeli kids to stop it, knock it off. But of course, when you're young, you know everything. But when you're a young Jewish kid, you really know everything. So this is nothing new. I'm reading about this happening, the first anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. This is the 19-teens. And what I saw last year myself in 2023, same thing. Nothing's changed in the Holy Land. And you have to realize, too, what you're starting to see is a gap between world Jewry and the Jews that are in Palestine. What is the project, really? And their idea is our project is the project that matters. We don't care if pretty much all the Jews everywhere else in the world die. Doesn't matter. What matters is that the Palestinian project prevail, right? That's their idea. There was a confrontation between cultures, but also between Israel and the exile, as it was called. Leaders in Palestine had their own ideas how to run matters and saw the commission as a foreign body. This conflict would deepen over time. And indeed it would. I'll give you some ideas when we're moving towards the war, actually, in the middle of the war. A few years earlier, Ben-Gurion had made the following statement about the rescue of German Jewish children. If I knew that it was possible to save all the children in Germany by transporting them to England, but only half of them by transporting them to Palestine, I would choose the second. Because we face not only the reckoning of those children, but the historical reckoning of the Jewish people. It's always the lives of children never matter to them, not even their own children's lives. He was speaking in December 1938, a short time after Kristallnacht. To make sure he was not misunderstood, Ben-Gurion added, like every Jew, I'm interested in saving every Jew wherever possible, but nothing takes precedence over saving the Hebrew nation in its land. The tendency to see the Jews of Europe as human material, necessary to establish a state, rather than seeing the state as a means to save the Jews, guided the Zionist leadership in setting its immigration policy. Again, this is their own people. They saw their own people as simply a means to an end. And if some of them have to die, that's okay. What matters is this. And you see this gap between this idea of if God gave us the land, and there's all this theological work, but there's no sense of trust in God. There's this idea, well, it's all up to us and we're going to do it, and no mention of God whatsoever. So all throughout this time period and leading up to the present day, there's this theological mix to the way that Zionists will talk, even though they themselves are secular. Sometimes I would argue probably atheists. They probably don't believe in God at all. Certainly they couldn't, by their actions, believe in God. But they love to use theological language when it suits them, even though they don't believe in it. Ben-Gurion again. And I have to say, it galls me to say this, but David Ben-Gurion, what a leader. What a dramatic and gifted leader. And let's say the Mandela of the Jews, the Palestinians did not possess an equivalent leader. And if they did, things could have been very different. But David Ben-Gurion was a very gifted leader in many ways. I'm not saying that I like what he did, but you can't ignore the fact that he was a very successful and very intelligent leader. More from Ben-Gurion. I was not well versed on matters of saving the Jews of Nazi-occupied Europe, even though I was chairman of the Jewish Agency. The heart of my activity was enlisting Jewry in the demand to establish a Jewish state. So, there's so much more I could say here. Because I'm thinking about all the different aspects that the book covers, but the book is moving in a chronological way from the British, the Turks leaving the land, the British coming, the mandate being established, the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs. And that's why I've chosen to just, instead of speaking about the book chronologically, is just to take the book from aspects of these three parties, from the Jews, the Palestinians, and then the British, and in a sense, the UN. One of the ideas that Ben-Gurion and other Zionists would try to put forward when the few times that they would talk to the Arabs is, listen, we're very good about developing stuff. We've got a lot of money. We're going to develop this land, and it's going to be good for all of us. And the response always from the Arabs, and I don't have the quote, but there was a quote from somebody who said, I would rather that we were backwards for 100 years than have you all do this for us, which you could take it or leave it. I don't think that's a right answer. It's a wrong answer. You could allow some other people to develop the land for you and take advantage of it. I'm not arguing about that. But you could see that the Jewish argument was leading with money, that we can make a lot of money for everybody, so you should just step back and let us do this. And they would consistently make that argument. Palestine was an underdeveloped, underpopulated country, and only the Jews could develop it for the good of all its citizens. because only they had the necessary money, enthusiasm, and manpower. But you'd have to believe that they wanted to do that as opposed to them saying that they wanted to do that. I've given this Ben Gurion quote early. I think I might have given this quote when I did my review of the Israeli lobby. Ben Gurion said, were he an Arab, he would also rebel with even greater intensity and with greater bitterness and despair. So he understood the position of the Palestinians, and he even said, if I would have been a Palestinian, I would have reacted the same way. But wouldn't that make him anti-Semitic? Remember, the argument is anyone who rebels against the Israelis, anyone who rebels against the Jews is anti-Semitic. But once again, this is a crazy idea, because there were even the Jewish terrorists were being called names by the Zionists. If you might know about Etzel, Etzel was a very extreme wing within Zionism, let's say in the style of the revisionists and Zev Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin, all these far, and I laugh when I say right wing. I'm like, right wing of the Israelis. I mean, like, how much further right wing can you get? Ben Gurion calls Etzel a Nazi gang and Jewish Nazis. The revisionists are liable to murder each and every one of us sitting here, Ben Gurion told his colleagues in the Histrodute. He compared Begin to the Fuhrer. So, I mean, here it is. The Jews, the Zionist Jews are calling their own extreme Zionists, terrorists who were going out on the road killing Palestinians, women and children. They were calling them Nazis. The last quote I'm going to read you today is once again a reminder to me that nothing's changed in 100 years, more than 100 years, in 150 years, that there is still overwhelming force used against the Palestinians. The next day, some of the Jews set out for their newly acquired land. The British police were present to defend them as required by law. Some of the Al-Fula farmers threw stones. One of the Jews opened fire and an Arab was killed. So, you throw a rock at somebody and they respond by shooting a gun. You cannot just be killed necessarily by a rock, especially if you see a rock coming towards you, you can duck. But the response, and we still see it today all throughout Israel and the occupied territories, if a young Palestinian boy throws a rock just to express some kind of frustration, some kind of resistance against the occupier, which he has a moral and legal right to do, and I would argue probably even a duty, he is responded to with gunfire, usually murderous gunfire. But here we are, back during the time of the mandate. One of the Jews opened fire and an Arab was killed. Haaretz regretted the incident. Colonel Kish of the Zionist executive was concerned that the event would increase the difficulty of purchasing land in the future. No one should have been carrying firearms, he wrote. 2 Jews were arrested, charged with murder, convicted, and sentenced to jail terms. They were, however, acquitted on appeal. Their trial provoked great public interest. And once again, we see another theme. Jews who kill children in disproportionate force for no reason, they are never going to be punished in Israel, because Israel is a terrorist state. It's a state that likes to murder women and children. It has been doing it since before it was the state of Israel, when it was the Haganah, when it was Lehi, when it was Etzel. This is something they like doing because the land belongs to them and everyone else should just leave. And if what you hear from me is, I don't know, dark irony, frustration, it's because it's all here in black and white. The thing is that most people are not going to take the time to read a 500-page book. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to, but I'm saying that if you really want to understand these issues, you're going to have to dig deeper than the mainstream media, because the mainstream media is not going to ever criticize Israel. It's not permitted to. But the opposite idea then has to be Israel has never done anything wrong. You have to hold that idea and examine it. Is it possible that a state has never acted incorrectly ever? If it has acted incorrectly, is it worth investigating? So if you're going to defend the state unconditionally, as the United States does, it always uses this term unconditional, which is immoral to say such a thing. You should, if you're willing to speak about this very publicly, take the time to read a little bit more. So that's why I'm recommending this excellent book. And as I say, after this review finishes, The next review will come on right away, which will be talking about the Arabs. But in the meantime, as always, if you like this, please hit like, subscribe, share this with somebody who's interested in learning more about, let's say, the period before 1948. This takes us all the way up until, let's say, late 1947, I think. He takes us right up until that time period. So when the British leave. Remember, the British leave in April, May of 1948. Consider buying the book. There'll be a link to that in the description, joining my Patreon, my YouTube members. And remember that a portion of the proceeds of all my reviews in 2024 are going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which provides medical care to Palestinian children who could not otherwise receive it. As always, enjoy your reading, and I'll see you in the very next video on the same book.